Okay, so Isabella is gone. She has run away with Heathcliff, and only Mrs. Dean knew about it. And Mrs. Dean decided not to tell anybody because honestly, Edgar has had enough for a night. Catherine was sick apparently, and Edgar was beside himself with worry. Besides, there was nothing they could do now, probably. It's not like they could catch up with that horse, and nobody knew where Isabella and Heathcliff were going anyway. Mrs. Dean didn't sleep that night, and neither did Edgar because he was taking care of Catherine all night. The next morning, another servant found Isabella's room empty, and Mrs. Dean had to act all surprised, like, "What? Isabella's gone? Oh no." Anyway, everyone was scared to tell Edgar, but when they finally did, Edgar didn't say anything. He just looked down like he was disappointed. Mrs. Dean even tried to coax Edgar. She was like, "What should we do now? Should we send some people to go get her, to go find her?" But Edgar said that Isabella went with Heathcliff willingly, and she had a right to do whatever. Edgar said from now on, Isabella is only his sister by name, and that was it. Because it's Isabella who disowned him, not the other way around. So apparently, Edgar actually had a talk with Isabella a few days before all of this happened. It was right when he learned that Heathcliff did something inappropriate with her. He also asked Isabella, like he did with Catherine, to choose between Heathcliff or himself, her own brother. Edgar said at the time that if Isabella chose Heathcliff, she would in effect disown Edgar as her brother. So clearly, Isabella has made her choice. 2 months have passed since that night, and Catherine was gradually nursed back to health to the credit of Edgar. Mrs. Dean said Edgar was there every step of the way. There was nothing else he did but take care of Catherine. But also, Catherine wasn't really fully okay. It's true that she wasn't hysterical anymore, but during those 2 months of recovery, she had actually caught brain fever, and because of that, Catherine had lost whatever fire she had in her. It was like, this girl isn't Catherine anymore. She's just a shell of Catherine. And Catherine knew that too. She knew that there was some part of her that was permanently gone. And it wasn't like she was angry about it. It was like she was resigned to it. One day, Edgar and Catherine were looking out the window, and Edgar mentioned how just last year he wished for Catherine to be married to him and be under this very roof. And now she is, but now he also wished that Catherine was outside instead, up in those hills, because he feels like being back on the moors would cure her. And all Catherine said that there is only one more time when she would be up on those hills, and that was when Edgar would bury her. Catherine said next year he will wish once again that she were under his roof, but then she would be up on that hill. To be fair, Catherine didn't say that in a snarky way. It was more of a wistful, sad way, which shows how much fire was lost within her. But everybody in the house was counting on Catherine to get better, especially since they discovered that Catherine was actually pregnant. Anyway, after those 2 months, Edgar and Mrs. Dean received letters from Isabella. Isabella wrote rather formally to Edgar announcing her marriage to Heathcliff, and Mrs. Dean saw on the very bottom of that letter that she had scribbled an apology to Edgar, like she was in a hurry. It wasn't formal. Edgar didn't reply to that letter. Mrs. Dean also received a letter from Isabella. Basically, the letter can be summed up to a question, which is, what the hell did I just marry? Isabella had apparently just arrived at Wuthering Heights after 2 months of being away with Heathcliff, basically eloping with Heathcliff. Isabella asked Mrs. Dean in the letter to tell Edgar that she would give anything to see him again, but also don't tell him how much she has been suffering. Isabella said in her letter to Mrs. Dean that Wuthering Heights has been a nightmare from the very second she arrived. She told Mrs. Dean about the very first night that she was there. Joseph scowled at her, as usual, at the gate. She went into the kitchen by herself, and it was so dingy and messy. Hareton was there, and Isabella said his eyes were like Catherine's. Isabella tried to say hi to Hareton. After all, Hareton was kind of her nephew anyway, but Hareton just cursed at her and threatened to unleash the dogs on her. Isabella said Hareton's speech was very rough and very vulgar, that Isabella couldn't understand him at first. So Isabella went back out of the house that night and walked around for a while. She looked for Heathcliff, but he was nowhere to be found, so he just dropped her off at Wuthering Heights and he went away by himself. After a while, Isabella found Hindley. Hindley was now really skinny and had hair up to his shoulders. Hindley didn't curse at her, at least, but he wasn't exactly nice either. He led her into the house, and Isabella said the floors were all gray because they were so dirty. The shiny tableware that she used to admire when she would come over when she was a kid, they were all tarnished now. So Isabella asked Hindley how she could call a maid so she could go to the bedroom, but Hindley just ignored her. He just paced around the house, muttering to himself, and Isabella at this point was too scared to say anything again or move. Everyone in the house was crazy. Isabella at that point thought about Thrushcross Grange that was just 4 miles away. It had the only people left in the world who she loved, but she said it might as well be an ocean apart at this point because she knew she couldn't go back, not after running away. Isabella sat in the living room with Hindley for literal hours with nothing to do. She just watched Hindley pace back and forth, cursing at Heathcliff under his breath. Isabella tried to listen for a woman's voice somewhere in the house, but there was none. And finally, Isabella started to cry. And that was when Hindley stopped pacing. It looked like he forgot she was there in the room the whole time, and Isabella cried about needing a maid to come bring her to the bedroom. She was just so tired. But Hindley said there was no maid in here. Just go ask Joseph for help. So Isabella went back to the kitchen, and Joseph was making a miserable pot of oatmeal for dinner. And Isabella, to be fair to her, she wasn't acting fully like a complete princess. She did grow up with a house full of servants, so she didn't really need to do anything herself. But she offered to make oatmeal, and she did. After that, Joseph brought her upstairs to show her all the available rooms in the house, but all of it was all dirty and grimy and unlivable. Finally, Heathcliff came home, and when Isabella said she couldn't get into their room because it was locked, Heathcliff looked almost offended and disgusted. He said, "Go find somewhere else to sleep," and also, he just found out that Catherine was sick. And since he couldn't get revenge on Edgar just yet, he would make Isabella suffer in his place. And that was the end of the letter. So as soon as she could, Mrs. Dean visited Wuthering Heights to check on Isabella. Mrs. Dean, before going, she asked Edgar about whether he wanted to visit too, or at least send a letter, but Edgar said no. He said that Isabella has made her choice. She is part of Heathcliff's family now, and he wants nothing to do with Heathcliff and his family. So Mrs. Dean didn't have a choice. She had to go to Wuthering Heights alone. When she entered Wuthering Heights, the contrast between Heathcliff and Isabella were appalling. Heathcliff was glowing. He never looked better. Respectable, dignified, handsome. And Isabella? She looked terrible. Her clothes were dirty. She didn't even bother to curl her hair anymore. Her pretty face was listless. She was blending into Wuthering Heights like the rest of the people in there. And on top of that, Mrs. Dean had to give the bad news to Isabella that Edgar didn't write back. And then the interrogation started because Heathcliff wanted to know how Catherine was. He didn't really know because he ran away with Isabella right before Catherine fell fully sick. So Mrs. Dean had to tell him everything. And she told Heathcliff that Catherine is just recovering. Catherine is not the same Catherine that Heathcliff knew anymore. And the best thing that Heathcliff can do for her is to stay away. Leave the country even if you can. Any encounter between Heathcliff and Catherine may kill her. Just please leave her with Edgar. And that, of course, angered Heathcliff. He was like, if Edgar truly loved her, he would allow Heathcliff to see her. Because if the roles were reversed, if Heathcliff were Catherine's husband and Catherine wanted to see Edgar, he would let her. All for Catherine, he would let her. Heathcliff said Edgar doesn't even understand that level of love. Heathcliff said death and hell would be the theme of his own existence without Catherine, and Catherine probably feels the same way. Besides, she probably loves Edgar like she does a pet, maybe. That doesn't compare to how Catherine loves Heathcliff. And Isabella was right there. She was in the room while Heathcliff was professing his love to Catherine. Isabella tried to defend Edgar and Catherine, saying Edgar and Catherine's love was true and they loved each other very much, but Heathcliff just asked her to shut up. Heathcliff even told Mrs. Dean that finally, Isabella has now understood that Heathcliff doesn't love her. He tried to tell Isabella, but she was too insistent that this was a dark horse bad boy that she could somehow turn into her prince. And now, she finally hates Heathcliff. Finally, good. Heathcliff even turned around to Isabella and asked, "Are you sure? Are you sure you hate me now? You promise? You won't come crawling and pouting back to me later?" And then Heathcliff shoved Isabella out of the room, like physically shoved her out and said, "Go away. I want to talk to Mrs. Dean privately." And then when they were alone, Heathcliff demanded Mrs. Dean to promise to sneak him into Thrushcross Grange. He said he had been actually standing outside of Thrushcross Grange for 6 hours every day, but he just couldn't get inside. He just wants to see how Catherine is doing, see her face to face. And Mrs. Dean, of course, said no. She said no so many times. But Heathcliff just wouldn't let her go. He was like, "You can't even leave this house until you promise me." Finally, Mrs. Dean agreed out of pressure, and also in her mind. She knew that she was betraying Team Edgar, but she also thought that maybe seeing Heathcliff would jumpstart that spark that Catherine had. Maybe this would help her heal in a way. It was about 3 days before Mrs. Dean could give Heathcliff's letter to Catherine. It was a letter asking if he could come see her. She waited until it was a Sunday and the house was empty because everyone was in church except for Mrs. Dean and Catherine. Catherine that day, once again, she looked peaceful. She didn't really look like herself anymore. She lost that fire within her. But what replaced that was this kind of unearthly beauty. So Mrs. Dean gave Catherine the letter, and at first Catherine didn't even touch it. She was so out of it, it didn't even look like it registered to her that there was a letter in her lap. It wasn't until Mrs. Dean said that it was from Heathcliff that Catherine did a little jolt. She opened the letter, and after reading it, she just sighed. It was like she was just tired of it all. Mrs. Dean asked Catherine whether it was a yes or a no. Can Heathcliff come see her? But before Catherine could react, they heard footsteps coming in. It was Heathcliff. Urgent footsteps. He decided to just break in and enter into the house, and within seconds of them seeing each other, they clung to each other and kissed each other furiously. Mrs. Dean said it was actually Catherine who kissed him first. And not only was this an awkward sight to see for Mrs. Dean, obviously, but it was also scary. Mrs. Dean noticed that Catherine clung to Heathcliff so hard that she actually pulled out his hair, like there was a clump of hair in her hands. And Mrs. Dean noticed that bruises were starting to form on Catherine's arm where Heathcliff had held her. And once the two were finished kissing in front of Mrs. Dean, Catherine told Heathcliff basically that she was going to die because of him. He and Edgar broke her heart, and now she was going to die. Catherine asked Heathcliff how many years is he going to live after she's gone. One day, would he look at her gravestone and say, "That's Catherine Earnshaw. Once upon a time I loved her, but now I love my children more. And when I die, I won't rejoice about joining her in the afterlife. I would be more sorry that I am leaving my own children." Which is a little messed up, but yeah. Catherine's back, and with that, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the mind games are also back. But Heathcliff said, "Why are you even talking like this? Don't you realize that these words are going to be seared into my brain and it will eat me until I die?" Needless to say, Heathcliff was upset. He tore himself away from Catherine and he walked to the fireplace and stood there covering his face. Just imagine the most dramatic way you can stand in front of a fireplace. That's it. Catherine called to Heathcliff, but he wouldn't budge. He wouldn't react. So, the weak Catherine tried to stand up. It looked like it was too much for her. She made a spring finally to Heathcliff because apparently she was too weak to walk over or to hold her own weight. This was her last ounce of strength, and she used it to pounce on Heathcliff. And just in time, Heathcliff turned around and caught her. When Heathcliff turned around, Mrs. Dean realized that actually he had been crying. That's why he wouldn't move, or that's why he was covering his face at the fireplace. So, Heathcliff caught Catherine and they were locked together again. Heathcliff held onto her so fiercely, Mrs. Dean thought that Catherine was going to suffocate. Catherine wasn't even moving at that point. Heathcliff asked Catherine why she would betray her own heart. If she loved him this much, then why would she go to Edgar? She was too afraid of degradation by choosing Heathcliff, and now all of this is because of her. Heathcliff said it wasn't he who broke Catherine's heart, it was her own doing. And Catherine asked Heathcliff to forgive her. She said yes, if she was dying now, it was her own fault. And that's when Heathcliff hit her with one of the most quotable quotes in the book, which was, "I can forgive what you have done to me because I love my murderer. But yours? How can I forgive your murderer?" So, Mrs. Dean was very uncomfortable, but also she noticed that church would be over by now. She told Heathcliff that he better leave before more trouble comes. And Heathcliff did try to leave. But Catherine had this wild, desperate look in her now. She clung to Heathcliff and refused to let him leave. She said she would die if he did. And finally, Heathcliff was like, "Okay, fine, I'll stay. If he shoots me, sure, okay." Edgar ran into the house. He had heard a commotion from outside, and before he could react violently when he entered the sitting room, Heathcliff asked him to take care of Catherine first, because it looks like she had fainted from all of this. Edgar and Mrs. Dean worked on Catherine. Edgar immediately forgot about Heathcliff, and then Heathcliff went back to the garden to hide. That night at midnight, a premature baby girl was born to Edgar and Catherine Linton. This baby was just 7 months old. They named her Catherine too, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll call her Kathy. Anyway, everyone started calling this baby girl Kathy anyway. 2 hours after Kathy was born, her mom, Catherine Linton, passed away. There were all sorts of despair in the house, especially to Edgar Linton. First, because the love of his life just died, and secondly, because he does not have an heir. It's a girl. Kathy's a girl. It means that when he dies, everything goes to Isabella, not to his own daughter, Kathy. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dean knew that Heathcliff must still be out there hiding in the garden. So in the morning, as soon as she could, she went to the garden, and there she found Heathcliff. It looked like he was standing still in there for hours because he was covered in dew, and also birds had started to form a nest nearby. It meant that they thought this man was a piece of timber. But before Mrs. Dean could say anything, Heathcliff said he knew that Catherine was dead. He wanted to know how she died and if she said anything about him before she died. Mrs. Dean said Catherine barely recognized anybody after Heathcliff left, and she died sort of peacefully after giving birth to baby Kathy. Mrs. Dean said she hoped that Catherine finally had peace now in heaven. But Heathcliff wouldn't hear it. He wished that Catherine wasn't at peace. He said, "Come haunt me instead. Take any form, just haunt me until I can join you." And then Heathcliff banged his head on the tree trunk, and Mrs. Dean noticed blood on it. So it meant that Heathcliff was banging his head on that trunk the whole night. And so Mrs. Dean left. She was like, I can't handle whatever this is. Catherine was not due to be buried for a week, so for a while she had an open coffin in the house. Edgar stood guard all day, every day. And Hindley was invited to come see Catherine's remains, but he never came. He meant to come to the funeral. He even prepared for it. He didn't drink as much. He tried to be as sober as he could be. But in the end, he just sat on a chair and he didn't go. Isabella, on the other hand, was not even invited to come. During those days when Catherine had an open coffin, Mrs. Dean left a window open one time to allow Heathcliff one last look. Mrs. Dean made sure at that time that Edgar wasn't around. It was one of those rare times. After Heathcliff left, Mrs. Dean noticed that the lock of hair that Edgar had put in Catherine's locket was on the floor. There was a lock of Edgar's hair on the floor. And when Mrs. Dean opened the locket, it was replaced by Heathcliff's dark hair. So Mrs. Dean was like, that was sneaky. And then she put both Heathcliff's and Edgar's hairs into Catherine's locket. In the end, Catherine was not buried in the Linton family tomb. She was buried outside on the hills, where she could be with nature. One day, Mrs. Dean was taking care of little baby Kathy in the sitting room. Edgar, at this point, was still deep in mourning. He was locked up in his room. So Mrs. Dean and baby Kathy were just hanging out alone when suddenly Isabella came bursting into the door. Isabella had finally run away from Wuthering Heights. She had somehow recovered from wanting to die herself to wanting to just go and save herself. She didn't want Edgar to know that she was there. She knew she wasn't welcome at Thrushcross Grange. She just asked Mrs. Dean for some supplies and a carriage to just help her get away. And Mrs. Dean did that. She helped Isabella run away. A little while later, Mrs. Dean learned that Isabella had given birth to a baby boy. Apparently, she was pregnant at the time when she ran away. Isabella named the baby Linton, so his name was Linton Earnshaw. Heathcliff apparently learned about the kid too. He learned it from other servants from extracting information, but Surprisingly, he didn't really chase after Isabella or his son. He only told Mrs. Dean that someday, when he wants the boy, he will have him. Instead, Heathcliff was more focused on Hareton Earnshaw. That's because 6 months after Catherine's death, Hindley Earnshaw also passed away. He had drunk himself to death. And when Mrs. Dean learned about Hindley, I think she was the only one who really mourned for him like a family member, because there was no one else. No one was there to give him a proper funeral, so Mrs. Dean volunteered to look after the funeral arrangements all by herself. Also, Mrs. Dean tried to arrange for Hareton's future, but she learned from all these funeral arrangements that Hareton doesn't inherit Wuthering Heights from Hindley. In fact, Hareton doesn't inherit anything. Hindley was basically in so much debt from Heathcliff that everything he had, which was probably in the negative anyway, all of it went to Heathcliff. Hindley's lawyer said that Hareton was now homeless and penniless, basically. Mrs. Dean begged Edgar to let Hareton stay with them at Thrushcross Grange. After all, Edgar was the only technical distant relative that Hareton had. But for some reason, Heathcliff wanted to keep Hareton at Wuthering Heights. And Edgar, he didn't care enough at that point to fight for Hareton. And so, Hareton stayed with Heathcliff, who is now the master of Wuthering Heights. And that's part 5 of Wuthering Heights. But that's not the end though. After this, we're jumping 12 years in time. So see you in part 6.